Emma had always been drawn to old buildings, and when she found a cheap apartment in a historic part of town, she thought it was too good to pass up. The building was tall and narrow, with creaky wooden floors and antique fixtures that gave it a timeless charm. But what truly captivated her was the empty third floor. The landlord mentioned it was closed off for repairs, and no one had lived there in years. Emma shrugged it off, she didn't care much for neighbors anyway. She moved into her second-floor apartment and quickly settled in. But from her first night in the apartment, she noticed something strange. Every night, just after midnight, she heard faint footsteps above her. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. She tried to ignore it at first, thinking it must be an old building settling or perhaps the wind. But the footsteps continued, always starting at midnight and ending just before dawn. Curiosity got the better of her after a few days. She asked the landlord again if anyone lived above her. He looked at her with a serious, almost frightened expression and said, "No. No one has lived on the third floor for a long time. It's locked, completely sealed." Emma didn't press further. The landlord seemed rattled, and for the first time, she felt a cold unease creeping into her bones. That night, as she lay in bed, the footsteps started again. This time, they were louder. It wasn't just pacing, it sounded as though someone were dragging something heavy across the floor. Unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was up there, Emma decided to investigate. The next evening, she waited until the footsteps started. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and her phone, she crept out of her apartment and made her way to the third floor. The stairwell was dimly lit, and as she climbed, the air grew colder. At the top of the stairs, she found the door to the third floor. Just as the landlord had said, it was locked with a thick padlock. But the strange thing was, it looked old, rusted, as if it hadn't been touched in years. Yet, the footsteps were louder now, just on the other side of the door. Emma's heart pounded as she pressed her ear to the wood. There was no mistaking it, someone was inside, moving around. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Silence filled the air, heavy and suffocating. Emma took a step back, her breath shaky. Then, without warning, the door creaked open, just an inch, as though something on the other side had unlocked it for her. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, but her curiosity pushed her forward. Slowly, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The third floor was completely dark, and the air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and something else, something rotten. She swept her flashlight across the room, revealing old furniture covered in white sheets, untouched for years. Then, in the far corner, she saw it, a figure. Pale, thin, hunched over. Its back was turned to her, and it appeared to be crying, its shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The figure was draped in a tattered, old-fashioned gown, its long hair tangled and matted. Emma's heart raced, but she couldn't move. The figure turned its head slowly, too slowly, revealing a face twisted in agony, its eyes hollow and sunken, as though it had been crying for centuries. The mouth stretched open in a silent scream, but no sound came out, just the suffocating silence that wrapped around her like a shroud. Emma stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. The figure began to rise, its body creaking like old wood, its movements unnatural and jerky. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled with the doorknob, desperate to escape. But then she heard it, whispers, soft and raspy, coming from all around her. "You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have opened the door." The air grew colder, and Emma felt a presence behind her, breathing down her neck. She dared to look over her shoulder. The figure was right there, its hollow eyes locked onto hers, inches away. Its mouth was still open, that terrible, silent scream frozen on its face. Slowly, it reached out a hand, skeletal and trembling, brushing against her arm with a touch colder than death. Emma screamed, yanking the door open and tumbling down the stairs. She didn't stop running until she was back in her apartment, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Her heart pounded, and she could barely catch her breath. But even through the door, she could hear it, the slow, deliberate footsteps, pacing above her, just like before. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Emma packed her bags and left the apartment without a word to the landlord. She couldn't explain what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain: something lived on the third floor. Something that had been there for a long, long time. And it was still waiting. A few weeks later, she learned that the building had been abandoned. The landlord had disappeared, and no one seemed to know what had happened to him. The third floor remained sealed, just as it always had been. But every now and then, late at night, people passing by swear they can still hear footsteps coming from the empty building. Footsteps, and faint whispers, calling to anyone foolish enough to listen.